The dust of redemption's bluff didn't just settle on Clara May Thompson's worn-out boots. It coated her lungs, her hopes, her very soul. A widow at 26, with a daughter whose cough echoed the hollowness in her heart, she was a ghost in a town that had already buried her. Justice was a word for men with money and guns, and she had neither. But when the devil himself knocked on her door, a man forged in shadow and steel, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a deal. A home for her child, a life free from fear, in exchange for her. This is the story of that impossible choice, a bargain made in desperation, that would either forge a legend or shatter them all. The heat in the Arizona Territory was a physical entity, a predator that pressed down on the clapboard shack Clara May Thompson called home. It warped the wood, baked the dirt yard into a cracked mosaic of misery, and stole the breath from her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. The child's cough, a dry, rasping sound, like withered leaves skittering across stone, was the constant heartbreaking metronome of their lives. It had been 3 months since the funeral, 3 months since they had lowered her husband Frank into the unforgiving ground. 3 months of watching their world shrink to the size of this one-room shack on the edge of town, withering under the merciless sun. Frank had been a good man, a strong man with hands calloused from work and a laugh that could make the rafters ring. He had believed in fairness in the law, and in the future he was building on their small patch of land, blessed with a stubborn year-round creek that was the envy of every rancher in the county. It was that creek Clara knew with a certainty that chilled her despite the heat that had put him in his grave. Sheriff Barlow had called it a tragic accident, a dispute over a stray calf with some drifters. He'd said his fleshy face, a mask of practiced sympathy, his eyes holding no warmth at all. Frank drew on them they were faster. A shame. A lie. Everyone in Redemption's Bluff knew it was a lie. The drifters were never found, and Sheriff Barlow had been pressuring Frank to sell his land for a pittance for months. The official offer came from a cattle baron named Harrison, a man with a sprawling empire to the north, but Clara saw Barlow's greedy fingerprints all over it. Frank had refused. He had told Barlow to his face that the Thompson Creek would never belong to a vulture in a tin star. 2 days later, Frank was dead. Now the vulture was circling. Barlow and his deputies made a point of riding past her property daily, their presence a constant low-grade threat. The townspeople, once friends who'd shared Sunday dinners with them, now averted their gazes. To help the widow Thompson was to cross the sheriff, and no one in Redemption's Bluff had that kind of courage. The credit at Miller's General Store had been cut off. The doctor, a timid man named Peterson, charged double for Lily's medicine, his hands shaking as he took her last few coins. They were being starved out, isolated, and erased. Clara looked at her daughter, asleep on the thin corn husk mattress. Lily's face was pale, her chest rising and falling with a worrying flutter. The dust, constantly stirred by the wind that swept across the plains, was poison to her delicate lungs. Dr. Peterson had been clear. She needs clean air, Mrs. Thompson. Good food, less stress. He might as well have told her Lily needed a palace on the moon. Her stomach growled a hollow ache she had long grown used to. There was half a sack of flour left, a few wizened potatoes in the root cellar, and water from the creek. That was it. Her last attempt to find work mending clothes for Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had ended with the woman's hushed apologetic refusal. Barlow's men were asking about you. Clara, I can't afford trouble. Desperation was a physical taste, like ash in the back of her throat. She sank onto the rickety stool by the window, the wood groaning under her slight weight. She was wasting away her dress, hanging loose on a frame that had once been strong and vibrant. She looked at her hands raw and chapped from scrubbing floors and hauling water. These were not the hands of the woman Frank had married. They were the hands of a survivor, but survival was feeling less like a victory and more like a prolonged defeat. She stared out the window, past the wilting patch of vegetables she fought to keep alive towards the distant, imposing silhouette of the Blackwood Ranch. It wasn't a ranch so much as a fortress, a sprawling domain of dark timber and stone that dominated the entire valley. It belonged to Clayton Blackwood, a man who was more myth than resident in Redemption's Bluff. They said he was half Apache, his mother a woman from a forgotten tribe, and his father a ruthless trader who had carved a fortune out of the wilderness before drinking himself into an early grave. Blackwood had inherited his father's fortune and his mother's ferocity, and he had multiplied it tenfold. He owned more land, more cattle, and more water rights than anyone in the territory, including the very ground the town was built on. He rarely came into Redemption's Bluff, and when he did, people scattered. He moved with a predatory silence, his dark eyes missing nothing. He was not a man to be crossed, feared far more than the petty tyrant of a sheriff. People spoke his name in whispers, a boogeyman to frighten children, and a grim reality for grown men who owed him money. He was a force of nature, as untamable and dangerous as a flash flood or a prairie fire. Clara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. He was the last person on earth she would ever turn to for help. He represented everything that was dangerous and unpredictable about this land. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, a sharp knock rattled the thin wooden door. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a neighbor, nor the arrogant rap of one of Barlow's deputies. It was a solid, commanding sound, as if the person on the other side was not asking for entry, but announcing their arrival. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mama, shh. Sweet pea. Go back to sleep." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the old heavy iron skillet from beside the cold stove, her only weapon. She crept to the door, her breath held tight in her chest. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling betrayingly. A long silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Then a voice, low and resonant, cut through the evening air. It was a voice that held the rumble of distant thunder and the sharp edge of flint. "My name is Clayton Blackwood," the voice said, devoid of any emotion. "Open the door, Mrs. Thompson." Clara's blood ran cold. Clayton Blackwood, here, on her doorstep. It was impossible, unthinkable. Men like him didn't visit shacks on the edge of nowhere. They summoned people to them like kings, granting an audience. The skillet felt absurdly light in her hand. It was a tool for cooking, not for fending off the most feared man in the territory. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice, barely a whisper, pressed against the rough wood of the door. To talk, the voice replied, its patience seemingly infinite, and therefore all the more menacing. "We can do it through the door, or you can let me in. Either way, the conversation will happen." Her mind raced. If she refused, would he simply break the door down? Or would he leave only to return with some other, worse form of coercion? Barlow was a snake in the grass, but Blackwood was a wolf at the door. Swallowing hard, she slid the bolt, the screech of metal on metal, sounding like a scream in the quiet shack. She pulled the door inward just enough to see him. The stories had not done him justice. He was taller than she'd imagined his frame, lean but powerful, filling the doorway and blocking out the last of the dying light. He was dressed not in buckskin and beads, as the rumor sometimes claimed, but in the practical, well-made attire of a wealthy rancher, dark trousers, a crisp grey shirt, and a black duster that settled around his boots. But it was his face that held her captive. It was a map of harsh landscapes, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a straight, unforgiving mouth. His skin was the color of burnished copper, and his hair, black as a raven's wing, was tied back neatly with a leather cord. And his eyes, they were the darkest part of him, intelligent, watchful, and utterly unreadable. He held no weapon in his hands, yet he seemed more dangerous than any man she had ever met. His gaze swept over her, taking in the frayed dress, the fear in her eyes, the skillet, held like a shield. Then his eyes flickered past her, to where Lily was sitting up on the mattress, watching them with wide, curious eyes. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of an emotion she couldn't name before the mask of indifference slid back into place. He didn't move from the doorway. "May I come in?" He asked the question, a formality. Clara could only nod, stepping back. He moved with an unnerving grace, his boots making almost no sound on the packed earth floor. The shack, already small, seemed to shrink around him. He took off his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. It was a small gesture, but so at odds with his reputation that it threw her off balance. He surveyed the room in a single comprehensive glance, the bare shelves, the single pot on the cold stove, the patched blanket on the bed where Lily sat. His gaze lingered on the small medicine bottle on the crate next to the mattress. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice low so as not to frighten the child, "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. I know your situation. Your husband is dead. The sheriff is squeezing you. The town has turned its back. You are out of money and nearly out of food. Your daughter is ill." Each statement was a hammer blow, a stark, brutal truth laid bare on the floor between them. Clara flinched, shame and anger rising in a bitter tide. "What is it to you?" She bit out her grip, tightening on the skillet. He ignored her defiance. "Sheriff Barlow wants your land. More specifically, he wants your water. He's working for the railroad, not Harrison. They plan to run a spur line through this valley, and they need the water from your creek for the steam engines. Without that water, their plans are worthless. Barlow stands to make a fortune if he can deliver this land to them." The information settled on her with the weight of a tombstone. It was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just a greedy cattle baron. It was the railroad, an unstoppable force of industry and politics. Frank had never stood a chance. She had never stood a chance. "Why are you telling me this?" She whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Because knowledge is the only currency you have left," he said. "And it's not enough." He took a step closer, and she instinctively took a step back. Barlow will not stop. He will escalate his pressure. An accidental fire, perhaps, or he'll find a reason to declare you an unfit mother and have the child taken away, sent to an orphanage in the East. A gasp escaped Clara's lips. The thought of losing Lily was a physical pain sharper than any hunger. That was her breaking point, the one fear that eclipsed all others. He saw it in her eyes. He had known exactly where to strike. He stopped standing in the center of the room, a pillar of darkness and quiet power. He looked from her to Lily, then back to her. "You cannot win this fight alone. You need protection. You need a safe place for your daughter to live where she can have good food, clean air and medicine. You need a home." Her mind was reeling. Was this an offer of help from him? It made no sense. Clayton Blackwood was not known for his charity. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice raspy. There was always a price. In this world, no one gave anything for free. He held her gaze, his dark eyes seeming to strip away every one of her defenses, leaving her soul exposed and trembling. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that was almost unbearable. He gave her no pity, no false comfort, only the stark, cold finality of his terms. Your daughter needs a home, and my bed needs you." He said the words delivered with the flat finality of a judge's sentence. The words hung in the air obscene and shocking. They were an insult wrapped around a lifeline, a proposition so crudely transactional it stole the breath from her lungs. The skillet in her hand suddenly felt heavy again, and a hot, violent rage surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. Her first instinct was to scream at him, to order him out, to throw the skillet at his impassive face. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "How dare you? How dare you come into my home, my husband's home, and say such a thing to me?" Clayton Blackwood did not flinch. He did not react at all, his composure as absolute as a granite cliff face. "I am not here to court you, Mrs. Thompson. I am here to offer you a solution. You mistake this for a proposition of passion. It is not. It is a contract for survival. Your survival. I would rather starve." "You might," he conceded, his voice still level. "But will you let your daughter starve with you? Will you watch her cough herself into a grave because your pride is more important than her life?" The rage faltered, collapsing under the brutal weight of his logic. He was using Lily, her own precious daughter, as a weapon against her. He was twisting her love into a lever to force her hand. It was cruel. It was monstrous. And it was working. She looked over at Lily, who was watching them, her small face a mixture of confusion and fear. Lily's next breath ended in a weak, wheezing cough that tore at Clara's heart. The sound was a death knell for her pride. Clara's shoulders slumped. The skillet slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why me? You're a rich man. You could have any woman you want. Why do this?" "Because the women I could have are not the woman I require," he stated simply. "They are weak, gossiping, and foolish. I have observed you, Mrs. Thompson. You are resilient. You are a fighter. You are a devoted mother. You have dignity even in these circumstances. I require a woman of substance to manage my household and to share my bed. In return, I offer you my name and my protection. As Mrs. Blackwood, no one, not Sheriff Barlow, not the railroad, would dare touch you or the child. Mrs. Blackwood." The name felt alien, a betrayal of Frank and everything they had built together. But the protection he offered was absolute. To be under Clayton Blackwood's shield was to be untouchable. He was the one man in the territory more powerful than the railroad's money and Barlow's corruption. He saw the conflict raging in her eyes. "Let me be clear about the terms," he continued, his tone that of a man finalizing a cattle deal. "You and the girl will move to my ranch immediately. She will have her own room, the finest care, anything she needs. You will want for nothing. Your duties will be to run the household as its mistress. My staff will answer to you. In public, you will be my wife. In private." He paused, and for the first time, his gaze seemed to penetrate deeper, searching for something more than just her resolve. "You will share my bed. I will not be a brute, but I will not sleep alone. The arrangement will be a marriage in all ways. Is that understood?" It was a gilded cage, a prison of comfort and security. She would be trading her freedom, her body, her very identity for Lily's health and safety. She thought of Frank's face, of his warm smile, and the feel of his calloused hand in hers. The memory was a fresh stab of grief. Would he understand? Would he forgive her for this desperate, unthinkable act? Do what you have to. For Lily, he had once told her, his voice hoarse with fever, after a rattlesnake bite 2 years ago. She's all that matters. Clara closed her eyes, the stark reality of her choices laid out before her. On one path was starvation, sickness, and the ever-present threat of Sheriff Barlow, a path that almost certainly ended in Lily's death or their forced separation. On the other path was Clayton Blackwood, a life of material comfort at the cost of her soul. She would be his property, a beautiful, well-kept possession. But Lily would live. Lily would breathe clean air, eat nourishing food, and sleep in a warm bed safe from the dust and the terror. When she opened her eyes, the decision was made. The taste of ashes was still in her mouth, but it was the taste of her own incinerated pride, a sacrifice on the altar of a mother's love. "I have terms of my own," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She was no longer just a victim. She was a party to a negotiation. A flicker of something was its surprised respect passed through his dark eyes. "Go on, my daughter Lily. She is never to be harmed by you or anyone else. Her happiness and well-being are paramount. You will treat her with kindness?" "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "This land," she gestured around the pathetic shack, Frank's land. "It is not to be sold, not to Barlow, not to the railroad, not to you. It will be held in trust for Lily when she comes of age." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. A wise demand. "Agreed." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final, most important condition. "And the arrangement in your bed," she said the words, feeling like shards of glass in her mouth. "You said you would not be a brute. I want your word. You will be my husband, but you will be a gentle one. No force. Ever." He met her gaze, and the intensity of it made her feel like he was looking right through her. A long moment passed, the silence stretching until it was a tangible thing. "You have my word, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I have never had to force a woman in my life, and I will not start with my wife." He extended his hand. It was not a gesture of courtship, but of sealing a deal. His hand was large, the skin tanned and hardened by work, yet the fingers were long and elegant. After a moment's hesitation, Clara placed her own small, chapped hand in his. His grip was firm, warm and possessive. The bargain was struck. "Pack what you can carry," he said, releasing her hand. "My wagon is waiting. We leave at sunrise." He turned and left, as silently as he had arrived, leaving Clara standing in the middle of her shrunken world, the ghost of his touch still tingling on her skin. She had just sold herself to the devil, and as she looked at her sleeping daughter, she prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, that the price hadn't been too high. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was made in silence, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside Clara. She sat beside Clayton on the wagon bench, Lily bundled in a blanket between them, fast asleep. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, but Clara saw none of its beauty. She felt as though she were in a dream, a passenger in a life that was no longer her own. As they drew closer, the ranch revealed itself, not as a single house, but as a small, self-contained kingdom. A massive stone and timber ranch house stood as its heart, surrounded by sturdy barns, corrals, teeming with prize horses, and bunkhouses for the dozens of ranch hands who worked for Blackwood. The entire compound was nestled in a valley, protected by high, rugged cliffs on three sides, and it was clear that the creek, Frank's Creek, flowed right through the center of this domain before it reached her own small plot of land. He owned its source. He had owned it all along. The house itself was overwhelming. It was 2 stories tall with a wide covered veranda, built to withstand a siege. Inside, the rustic exterior gave way to a surprising and unsettling luxury. Dark, polished wood floors were covered with rich Navajo rugs. The furniture was heavy and masculine leather chairs, a massive stone fireplace, and shelves filled with books. It was a home built for a man who valued substance and power, not frivolity. It was clean, orderly, and utterly devoid of a woman's touch. A severe-looking middle-aged woman with her grey hair pulled into a tight bun met them at the door. Her name was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable Clayton said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is Clara May Blackwood, my wife. Her daughter, Lily. They will be living here now. See to it that their rooms are prepared and their needs are met. Mrs. Blackwood is the mistress of this house. Her orders are my orders." The housekeeper's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, her gaze flicking from Clayton to Clara with a mixture of shock and stern disapproval. But she was a professional. She simply nodded. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." "Welcome, ma'am." Clara was shown to a suite of rooms on the second floor that was larger than her entire shack. There was a sitting room with a small fireplace, a bedroom with a large four-poster bed draped in fine linens, and an adjoining room for Lily painted a cheerful yellow. It was more luxury than she had ever known, yet it felt as cold and impersonal as a hotel. The first few days passed in a blur of disorientation. Lily, after an initial period of shyness, was enchanted. For her it was a paradise. She had a warm bed, delicious food prepared by the ranch cook, a gentle mare Clayton assigned for her to learn to ride, and the clean high country air was already beginning to work its magic. Her coughing fits became less frequent, and a healthy pink blush returned to her cheeks. Seeing the life and joy return to her daughter's eyes was the only thing that kept Clara from succumbing to despair. It was the constant, necessary reminder of why she had made this devil's bargain. Her relationship with Clayton was a strange, formal dance. He was scrupulously polite, a perfect gentleman in all their public interactions. He referred to her as my wife when speaking to the staff, and treated her with a detached respect that was more unnerving than any overt cruelty would have been. They ate their meals together in a grand dining room, the long, polished table a chasm between them. He would inquire about her day, ask if she or Lily needed anything, and then retreat back into a thoughtful silence. He was a man of routines. He rose before dawn, worked his ranch with a tireless energy that commanded the respect of his men, and returned after dusk. He was an enigma. She saw his sharp business acumen when he dealt with cattle buyers, his deep knowledge of the land when he discussed water rights with his foreman, and a surprising gentleness when he showed Lily how to properly brush down her pony. But with her he remained distant, a fortress of a man whose walls were too high to see over. The nights were the worst. The first night she had laid in the enormous bed, rigid with fear, waiting for him to come to her. She had braced herself for the fulfillment of the most intimate part of their contract. But he never came. His own bedroom was at the opposite end of the long hallway. She heard his boots tread past her door, the sound fading away, followed by the quiet click of his own door closing. It was the same the second night and the third. He was honoring his word not to use force, but his absence was its own form of psychological torment. She was his wife, in name the mistress of his house, but he kept a chaste, unbreachable distance. It made her feel like a fraud, a housekeeper with a special title. Was he repulsed by her? Was he waiting for her to come to him? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She was living in a state of suspended animation, a prisoner waiting for her sentence to be carried out. One evening, about a week after their arrival, a storm rolled in the sky, turning a bruised purple. Thunder cannoned through the valley, and lightning split the darkness. A particularly loud clap sent a terrified Lily running from her room and into the dining hall where Clara and Clayton were finishing their silent supper. "Mama, She cried, tears streaming down her face, and launched herself into Clara's arms. "It's all right, sweet pea. It's just a storm." Clara soothed, holding her tight. Clayton watched them, his fork poised in his hand. The look on his face was unreadable. Lily, still sniffling, peeked at him from the safety of her mother's embrace. "Are you scared of storms, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked in a small voice. Clara tensed, expecting a curt dismissal, but Clayton put down his fork and looked directly at the child. "I was when I was your age," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "My mother used to tell me the thunder was the sound of the sky gods rolling stones, and the lightning was them striking flint to make a fire." Lily's eyes grew wide. "Really, really?" he confirmed. She said it was nothing to be afraid of, just a lot of noise while they did their work. He stood up from the table, his tall frame seeming to offer a silent promise of security. He walked over to them, and for the first time, he voluntarily entered their space. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Lily. "There is nothing in this house or on this land that will ever harm you, Lily," he said, his voice a low, sincere rumble. "Not the storm, not the coyotes, not any man. You are safe here. I promise you." He reached out a hand not to touch her, but as an open gesture. After a moment, Lily's fear seemed to subside. She reached out her own tiny hand and hesitantly placed it in his palm. He closed his fingers around it, gently, a silent, binding oath. Clara watched her breath caught in her throat. In that one small moment, she saw past the feared rancher, the ruthless businessman, the Apache of town gossip. She saw a man capable of profound gentleness, a man making a solemn vow to a child. The gilded cage suddenly felt a little less like a prison and a little more like a sanctuary. But it was a sanctuary with a dark, silent master, and she still had no idea what he truly wanted from her. The bed at the end of the hall remained empty, a silent, looming question mark in the center of her new life. Life at the Blackwood Ranch settled into a strange rhythm. Lily thrived, her laughter echoing in the large house, a sound Clara had feared she might never hear again. She was growing stronger, bolder, and she had developed a quiet, hero-worshipping affection for Clayton, who continued to treat her with a gruff but consistent kindness. He taught her the names of the constellations, pointing them out in the vast, clear night sky, and carved her a small, perfect horse from a block of pine. Clara, in turn, began to assert herself as the mistress of the house. She found purpose in the work, bringing a warmth and order to the sterile environment that even the stern Mrs. Gable begrudgingly came to respect. She had flowers planted in the barren dirt patches, by the veranda, aired-out rooms that had been sealed for years, and discovered that managing a large household staff was not so different from managing a small, struggling farm. It required foresight, firmness, and an eye for detail. She was useful, she was competent, but she was not a wife. The chasm between her and Clayton remained. The nights continued to be a silent agony of anticipation and confusion. His continued distance was a constant, unspoken commentary on their arrangement. It felt less like a marriage of convenience and more like a bizarre guardianship. The town she knew from the few supply trips she'd made with Clayton's foreman, a taciturn man named Henry, was buzzing with gossip. The widow Thompson had married Clayton Blackwood. It was a scandal, a mystery, a shock that had completely eclipsed Sheriff Barlow's machinations. And Barlow had been quiet. Too quiet. Since she had taken the Blackwood name, the daily rides past her old property had ceased. The threats had vanished. Clayton's protection was as absolute as he had promised. But Clara knew men like Barlow didn't simply give up. They retreated, they watched, and they waited for an opening. Her old shack and the precious land around it remained a source of deep anxiety. Clayton, true to his word, had his lawyers draw up papers placing the property in a trust for Lily. But once a week, Clara would ride out there alone on a gentle mare just to make sure it was still standing, to walk the banks of the creek that had cost Frank his life. It was a pilgrimage of grief and a reminder of the life she had lost. It was on one of these trips that she found it. The summer heat had baked the ground, but a recent rain had softened the earth near the small lean-to where Frank had kept his tools. The corner of a metal box was sticking out of the mud, uncovered by the erosion. Her heart hammered in her chest as she dug it out with her bare hands. It was Frank's old lockbox, the one he kept his important papers in. She had thought it lost, assumed Barlow or his men had taken it the day he was killed. With trembling fingers, she pried open the rusted latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Frank's ledger, but tucked into the back pages was something else. It was his handwriting, a series of entries from the weeks leading up to his death. Her hands shook as she read. He wrote of Barlow's threats of the pressure from the railroad, all things she had known. But then came the twist that made the blood drain from her face. October 12th, CB rode out today. Came alone. Made me an offer not for the land, but a partnership. Says he knows what the railroad is planning. Says they're trying to cheat him on a separate land deal further up the line. He wants to fight them, and my creek is the key. He offered to buy a controlling share of my water rights for a price that would set us up for life. Said it would give him the legal standing to block the railroad's eminent domain claim. A dangerous man, but he hates the railroad more than anyone. I told him I'd think on it. October 15th, told CB, I agree, the deal is solid. He paid me half the sum in gold coin, more money than I've ever seen. He said to keep this quiet. If Barlow knew we were partners, he'd kill me for sure. We signed the papers. He took his copy, I hid mine in the box. He gave me his word that if anything happened to me, he'd look after Clara and Lily. CB Clayton Blackwood. The world tilted on its axis. Clara sank to the ground, the journal clutched in her hand. It wasn't a random act of charity. It wasn't a cold, lustful proposition. It was a promise, a debt. Frank and Clayton Blackwood had been secret partners. Her husband's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was the murder of Clayton's business partner. And Clayton had never said a word. He had let her believe he was a callous opportunist. He had forced her into this humiliating bargain, letting her think she was selling herself, when all along he was simply fulfilling a vow he had made to her dead husband. Why the cruel charade? Was it a test, or was it something else, something deeper and more complicated? The cold proposition. Your daughter needs a home, and my bed needs you echoed in her mind. But now it sounded different. The cruelty of it seemed calculated, a brutal tool used to achieve a specific end. He needed to get her and Lily under his protection immediately, without revealing his hand to Barlow. If the sheriff knew they had been partners, he might have tried to harm Clara and Lily to get at Frank's copy of the agreement. By making it look like a sudden, scandalous marriage, he had thrown everyone off the scent. He had hidden his true motive behind a mask of ruthless desire. She sat there for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land Frank had died for. The whispers on the wind had finally told her the truth. She was not a possession. She was a responsibility, a legacy. And the silent, formidable man she had married was not her captor, but her husband's secret, sworn protector. Armed with this knowledge, she rode back to the ranch no longer a victim, but a woman with a purpose. She was going to confront Clayton Blackwood and demand the whole truth. The game had changed. Clara rode back to the ranch with a storm of emotions warring within her. Anger, relief, or confusion, and a strange burgeoning sense of admiration. The man she had feared, the man whose bed she had dreaded, was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. He had orchestrated their lives with the cold precision of a master strategist, all to honor a promise to a dead man. She found him in his study, a room she had never dared to enter. It was lined with books and maps, a decanter of whiskey, glowing amber on a small table. He was standing by the large window, looking out at the last rays of sunlight, painting the cliffs, his back to the door. He didn't turn as she entered, as if he had been expecting her. "You've been to the old place," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. She walked further into the room, stopping a few feet behind him. She held the journal in her hands like a weapon. "I found something. Frank's journal." Clayton slowly turned around. His face was a mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time she did not look away. She was no longer the frightened widow from the shack. She was his equal in this room. "He wrote about you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "About your partnership, the water rights, the promise you made to him." She held up the journal. "You made a vow to protect us." He didn't deny it. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. Why she demanded, her voice finally breaking with the strain of it all. Why the charade? Why let me believe? Why the cruel proposition? You could have just told me the truth. You could have offered me your protection as a friend of Frank's. He was silent for a long moment, the space between them crackling with unspoken words. Then he moved from the window, walking over to the decanter and pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. He held one out to her. She shook her head. He took a small sip from his own glass before setting it down. "Barlow is not a fool," Clayton began, his voice low and measured. "He's a rat, but a cunning one. If I had simply taken you in, offered you charity, he would have grown suspicious. He would have wondered why the great Clayton Blackwood was suddenly interested in a destitute widow. He would have dug, and his men would have torn your shack apart looking for a reason. They would have found the papers. He would have known I was involved." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a grim memory. "Once he knew I was Frank's partner, you and Lily would have become leverage against me. He would have threatened you, perhaps taken you to force me to surrender my claim. I could not risk that. The danger was too immediate. So you concocted this marriage?" she asked, the word still tasting strange. "It was the only way," he said. "A scandal is a perfect distraction. A reclusive half-breed rancher suddenly taking a beautiful young widow for a wife. It gives the gossips in town something to talk about besides land deals and railroad spurs. It's a story they can understand. Greed, lust, it's simple, it's believable, and it explains my interest in you, completely leaving no room for questions about water rights or secret partnerships. It made you my territory, and no one, not even the railroad, challenges what is mine. It was a cold, brutal, and brilliant strategy. He had used his own fearsome reputation as a shield. He had hidden his honor behind a mask of dishonor. And the part about your bed, she asked quietly, the question that had tormented her for weeks. Was that part of the strategy too? To make it all seem more believable? He looked down at his glass, then back at her. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw a crack in his formidable composure. She saw a flicker of something that looked like vulnerability. Yes, he admitted. At first, it was the crudest, most effective way to state my intentions, to make the arrangement seem purely selfish, a transaction. It was meant to shock you into accepting, to leave no doubt in anyone's mind about the nature of our bargain. He paused, and his next words were quieter, more hesitant. "But I also underestimated you, Clara. I did not expect it to be a lie I would come to regret." The use of her first name for the very first time sent a jolt through her. "I kept my distance because I had given you my word," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And because this entire arrangement was built on a foundation of deceit. I brought you into my home under false pretenses. I owed you the space to feel safe even if you hated me. To force myself on you would have made me no better than Barlow." The truth settled between them, vast and overwhelming. He had been protecting her not just from Barlow, but from himself. The empty bed down the hall had not been a sign of his rejection, but a mark of his respect. The gentleman she saw in flashes was not an act. It was the real man hidden beneath layers of calculated ruthlessness. Clara took a step closer to him, her anger dissolving into a wave of profound, heart-altering understanding. "Frank trusted you," she said softly. "He was a good man," Clayton replied, his voice thick with an emotion she now recognized as grief. "He stood up to Barlow when no one else would. He didn't judge me for my blood or my reputation. He shook my hand and looked me in the eye. In this part of the country, that is a rare thing. I will not fail him." In that moment, the last of her fear vanished. She saw him clearly, a lonely, powerful man bound by a fierce code of honor that the rest of the world could never comprehend. He had shouldered this burden alone, playing the villain to protect the family of the only man who had ever treated him as an equal. She closed the remaining distance between them, stopping directly in front of him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed under her touch, but he didn't pull away. "You're not failing him, Clayton," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." She looked up into his dark, searching eyes. "Barlow has Frank's copy of the agreement. But I have his journal, his words, his testimony from beyond the grave. We have the proof." A new light entered his eyes. Not just respect, but partnership. He cannot be allowed to get away with murder. Clayton said, his voice a low growl. "No." Clara agreed, her hand still resting on his arm, a silent promise. "He won't." The unmasking was complete. The bargain of the devil had been revealed as the vow of a saint, and in the heart of the gilded cage, two lonely souls finally found an alliance. They had a killer to expose, and a future to claim. The plan was simple, audacious, and hinged entirely on Sheriff Barlow's arrogance. Clayton sent word through his foreman that he would be in town to sign the final sale papers for the Thompson property. He leaked the information that his new wife had finally convinced him to wash his hands of her worthless, troublesome land. The bait was the deed of sale, which Barlow would believe nullified any previous agreements Frank might have made. The trap would be sprung in the most public place, in Redemption's Bluff, the saloon. Clara insisted on being there. "This is for Frank," she had told Clayton, her resolve as hard as steel. "I need to see it through. I need to be the one to show them what he was." Clayton had argued, but seeing the fire in her eyes, he had relented. This was her fight as much as his. They rode into town together, not in the wagon, but on horseback. Clayton on his powerful black stallion, and Clara on the gentle mare. Her back, straight, her head held high. She was no longer the destitute widow. She was Mrs. Blackwood, and she played the part to perfection. As they dismounted in front of the saloon, the town went silent. People stopped in the street, peering from behind curtains and out of shop doorways. Sheriff Barlow was waiting inside, seated at a table with two of his deputies and a portly, sweating man in a city suit, the man from the railroad. Barlow smirked as they entered his eyes, running over Clara with a possessive leer that made her skin crawl. Blackwood Barlow boomed a false joviality in his voice. "Glad to see you've come to your senses. And the lovely Mrs. Blackwood. Marriage seems to agree with you. Let's get this over with, Barlow." Clayton said, his voice flat and cold. He laid a rolled-up document on the table. The deed. Barlow's eyes gleamed. He unrolled it, his gaze scanning the legal text. Everything seems to be in order. He slid the paper and a pen over to Clara. "Just needs the grieving widow's signature." Clara stepped forward. The entire saloon was watching. She could feel the weight of their stares, their judgment, their curiosity. She picked up the pen, her heart hammering. This was the moment. She looked at Barlow, her expression one of cool disdain. "Before I sign away my husband's land," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "I'd like to read something. A final tribute to his memory." Before Barlow could object, she pulled Frank's journal from her reticule. She opened it to the last entry. Her voice, clear and unwavering, filled the saloon. "October 15th. Told CB, I agree. The deal is solid. He paid me half the sum in gold coin, more money than I've ever seen. He said to keep this quiet. If Barlow knew we were partners, he'd kill me for sure." A collective gasp went through the room. Barlow's face went from smug to chalky white. He lunged for the journal, but Clayton's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in a grip of iron. "There's more." Clara continued, her eyes locked on the terrified sheriff. "We signed the papers. He took his copy, I hid mine in the box. He gave me his word that if anything happened to me, he'd look after Clara and Lily." She closed the journal. "My husband, Frank Thompson, was murdered," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "He was murdered by that man." She pointed a trembling finger at the railroad representative and his hired killer, Sheriff Barlow, because his land and his water were essential for their railroad spur. "That's a lie," Barlow roared, struggling in Clayton's grasp. "It's the ravings of a hysterical woman." "Is it?" Clayton's voice was dangerously quiet. He released Barlow's wrist and threw a second document onto the table. It was his copy of the water rights agreement, signed by both him and Frank. "This is my copy of the partnership agreement, the one Frank mentioned in his journal. It proves Frank Thompson had a legal partner who would never sell his water rights to the railroad. His death was the only way to try and void that contract." The railroad man began to sweat profusely, looking for an escape. The townsfolk who had once shunned Clara were now staring at Barlow with dawning horror and contempt. They had been cowed by a common thug who had murdered one of their own for profit. "He killed Frank," someone yelled from the back. "He's a murderer," another voice cried out. The mood in the room had shifted, the collective shame of the town turning to a righteous fury. Barlow, seeing his power evaporate, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol, but he was no match for Clayton Blackwood. In a blur of motion, Clayton drew his own gun. A single shot rang out. Barlow's pistol clattered to the floor, his hand clutching a bloody wrist as he screamed in pain. His deputies, seeing their leader defeated, and the entire town turned against them, wisely raised their hands. It was over. The truth brought to light by a dead man's words, and a woman's courage had been more powerful than any gun. The railroad man was taken into custody by the U.S. Marshals Clayton had quietly arranged to have waiting in the next town over. Barlow and his deputies were locked in their own jail cells, their reign of fear at an end. As the sun set over Redemption's Bluff, Clara and Clayton stood on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch, watching Lily chase fireflies in the twilight. The town had a new name, now whispered in the streets, Justice. Clara turned to Clayton, the quiet man who had hidden his noble heart behind a terrifying mask. There were no more secrets between them, no more bargains. "Frank was right to trust you," she said softly. Clayton looked at her, and for the first time, His dark eyes held no shadows, only a deep, abiding warmth. He reached out and took her hand, his touch no longer a contractual obligation, but a tender, questioning gesture. "He gave me his word to look after you," Clayton said, his voice low. "But I am no longer doing this for him, Clara. I am doing this for me." She met his gaze, and in the quiet of the Arizona evening, she understood. This was not the end of a bargain. It was the beginning of a life forged in tragedy and deceit, but now free to become something true. She squeezed his hand, a silent answer that needed no words. Together they had found their own redemption, a home built not of stone and timber, but of courage, honor, and the promise of a shared dawn. And so the story of Clara May Thompson and Clayton Blackwood became a legend in the valley, a testament to how even in the dustiest corners of the West, courage can bloom and love can take root in the most unexpected soil. Theirs was a journey from desperation to salvation, from a devil's bargain to a sacred vow. It reminds us that behind the most fearsome reputations can lie the most honorable hearts, and that a mother's love is a force more powerful than greed and corruption. What did you think of Clara's incredible strength, of Clayton's hidden sacrifice? If this story of survival, love, and justice in the Old West moved you, please let us know in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more tales like this to life. Don't forget to hit that like button. If you enjoyed the journey, share this tale with a friend who loves a good Western drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.